This is our overview of the class and philosophy of secular humanistic Judaism by me. So if you have any questions or concerns, you know where to go. This is the author. And this is the third part of a three-part adult ed curriculum that we offer in rotation here at Kol Hadash. One is on Jewish history, the second part was on Jewish culture, the third is on philosophy, but you can enter at any point in that cycle, and it's fine to learn from that. And we've actually created videos now of for a full 2 years of Jewish history and Jewish culture. This will be completing the third year. We started this recording when we were doing them during the pandemic in the latter part of this class one cycle ago, so we'll be able to fill in the gaps, and I'll have to decide if I want to start recording again or just let people watch the last time I taught this end of the class next time. So as I said, this is part of an overview curriculum that covers the basics of our approach in many different ways, many different subjects. There's some introductory material in the course packet, including an overview of the reading list for the entire class. They're queued to a few core textbooks. So the main textbook, for example, for the Jewish history class is this volume called A Historical Atlas of the Jewish People by Eli Barnavi, which has wonderful timelines and pictures, and is a really good introduction to the sweep of the Jewish historical experience. And it's key to a number of different primary sources as well, as you'll see in each of the sections. The second year is on Jewish culture. We primarily key that to a book called The Guide to Humanistic Judaism, which is an A to Z listing of major topics of Jewish life, or of humanism, or of humanistic Judaism, and the intersection. And you'll see those listed there as well. Occasionally we'll refer to that in our philosophy class too, but not very much. And then this year is the philosophy class, so we'll jump down to that outline. As you'll see, we cover a number of very important issues in philosophy. These aren't always issues that are dealt with directly in Jewish theology in the same kind of categories. So you might not have a section of the Talmud called ontology, the study of how we know what we know. But that is a core part of philosophy. And there is sort of an implicit ontology, an implicit way to know what you know, or how you can have confidence or belief in something that is part of historical Jewish thought. Part of our goal in the class is to see where there are intersections and where there are disconnections between mainstream philosophy and Jewish thought, as is traditionally understood. And we'll also talk a little bit about the phenomenon called Jewish philosophy, which was trying to marry the two in the Middle Ages, actually a little bit later tonight. So you'll see the topics in the first part of the class are some is questions. What is reality? What is the nature of people? Then there are some ought questions about ethics and politics and social ethics, how we relate to each other. A number of questions focused on Jewish identity and Jewish history and the balance of the authority between the past and the present. And so that's the overview of the philosophy part of the class. The second half of the class, as I mentioned, is on our intellectual roots. So here's where we'll use that anthology, Judaism in a Secular Age, and we'll be talking about the Yiddishists who are focused on Yiddish language as the basis of Jewish identity, the Zionists who are focused on Hebrew and ultimately a Jewish state, the Jewish Enlightenment or Haskalah and its branches in more modern times of Reform and now Reconstructionist Judaism, and then some great thinkers, both Jews and non-Jews, because after all, ideas have influenced who we are even beyond the boundaries of Jewish ethnicity. And then the last piece is talking more explicitly about our movement itself. And so that's the overview of the class as we'll be going through it in the year. As I said, there are introductory essays and some thought questions after each unit. So you'll see here's a one-page introductory essay for introduction, a suggested reading, and some discussion questions, which we'll be turning to a little bit later tonight. Any questions, comments, or other responses to that overview before we dive into why philosophy?
So why bother with philosophy? A lot of people find philosophy really boring or really abstract and not relevant to daily life. Philosophy can also be really disappointing because its answers are not designed to make us feel good or to fit in with our preconceived psychological or emotional needs or notions. Often the answers philosophy gives us are very disappointing about the limits of our abilities, the limits of our knowledge, the fact we don't know what we think we know, I mean, this was the danger of Socrates, right? And the dawn of philosophy in Greece was that he was the wisest man in Athens because he knew that he didn't know things, and everybody else thought they knew. And the more he asked, that he would say, "Oh, I'm so happy to find someone who knows something." But then he would ask enough questions that it would prove they really didn't know what they thought they knew. And that's the danger of philosophy. That's why, in fact, he was killed or caused to commit suicide, because he was a danger to the pieties and the establishment of Athens. So, given that risk of philosophy, why are we doing it? Well, I have one text that sort of demonstrates the dangers of philosophy, or at least the objections to it that many people have. I have to get out of this ad here that shouldn't be there because it wasn't there before. All right, this is a short passage from a poem by John Keats called Lamia, but this passage is the one that's often cited. Do not all charms fly at the touch of mere cold philosophy, at the mere touch of cold philosophy? There was an awful rainbow once in heaven. We know her woof, her texture. She was given in the dull catalog of common things. Philosophy will clip an angel's wings, conquer all mysteries by rule and line, empty the haunted air and gnomed mine, unweave a rainbow. So we'll stop at that point. So what is it saying philosophy does? There was a beautiful, when it says awful rainbow, it means like full of awe, awe-inspiring. It was fantastic. And now we can list it. It's the dull catalog of common things. It's light going through water, which causes a spectrum. And no, there's no beauty anymore. Philosophy clips an angel's wings, because now the angels can't even do what they used to do. It conquers all the mysteries by rule. There's no magic anymore. There's no wonder. You empty the haunted air because there's no such thing as ghosts. And no, there's no gnomes in the mind because you go down there with a flashlight. You prove there's no, this is terrible. You unweave the rainbow. Now, there's actually a book by the evolutionary biologist, science advocate, and atheist advocate, Richard Dawkins, called Unweaving the Rainbow, based on this. And his point is that science is fantastic and marvelous. We wouldn't see, the up close of a satellite, up close of a asteroid when we crash into it with a rocket if we hadn't used science. We wouldn't see the surface of Mars. We wouldn't see the Crab Nebula. There's all these things we wouldn't see if not for science that are wonderful and marvelous and inspirational. So Dawkins' response to Keats is to say, no, unweaving the rainbow makes it more beautiful in a different way. But Keats' argument is that philosophy doesn't speak to the human heart. It doesn't have the imagination. It seems foreign, and it makes things less beautiful, magical, and wonderful. And so many people who are not fans of philosophy don't think to apply it generally, and they specifically don't want to apply it to their Jewish life because that's a place where they don't want to think through the implications of the way they live every day. And there's two real core challenges that our movement has to face in the changes that we've chosen to make in Jewish life. The first challenge we have is that for many people, they don't want to think about what they're saying in a Jewish context. It's old, it's in Hebrew, I don't understand it anyways. I'm singing it, so who cares? After all, I sing Christmas carols, and I don't believe that the heralds were singing, or that the merry gentlemen need to be rest because Christ our Savior was born. I know all the lyrics to all the songs. If they're playing in my car, I might sing them, but I don't mean them. So if I'm singing the Shema, or I'm singing a Kaddish, or I'm reciting a prayer in a service or a blessing for a particular moment, I do it because it's Jewish. It's my memories. It's what my people have done for centuries. It's a solidarity with Jewish culture. And honestly, I don't know what it means half the time anyways. And so who really cares? So the fact that people don't really want to think about what they're saying, and we've said to them, actually, you should think about what you're saying. Actually, if you said what you really believed, it'd be more satisfying. You can still do that in Hebrew. We just have to edit it a bit. And sometimes it'll work fine with the rhythm and cadence that you're used to. And sometimes it might be new and different, but it's still Jewish because we're doing it in a Jewish context and it's Jewish people doing it, even if it's new. But many people don't want to think that hard about it. There's an old line about Israelis who never go to synagogue, but they'll say, the synagogue I don't go to is Orthodox. Or, if I go to synagogue, I want it to look like what I remember it, which is why I never come, So they want it the old-fashioned way. So that's one of our challenges, is that we're challenging people to change things they want to keep the same, and we're challenging people to think about things they don't want to necessarily think about the implications of what they're saying. The other challenge we face is this propaganda version of Judaism that says Judaism is about deed and not creed. There's no things you have to believe in Judaism, people will tell you. It's all about doing good deeds and what you do in life, not what you believe. What's the basic of Judaism? It's doing mitzvahs, doing good deeds. And traditionally, according to Rabbinic Judaism, there were not just 10 commandments or mitzvot, there were 613 commandments. So just think about a religion that gives you 613 good deeds that you're supposed to do as the definition of what makes a full member of that community. Right? Sounds very compelling. Except if you actually read any list of those 613, the first few in any list are believe in God, fear God, know God, worship God. There's all kinds of God-focused things. About 40% of them are positive to do things, and 60% of them are negative do not do things, like don't eat this and don't talk to those people, the things that we might reject. And some of the positives aren't so great either, like wiping out the memory of Amalek. That's not a particularly nice thing to do, but that's one of the positive commandments. Breaking down idols, that's a positive commandment. Not to commit idolatry, that's negative. But those 613 commandments are also impossible for any one person to do, because some of them apply to women, some of them apply to men, and some of them apply to priests, and some of them apply to non-priests. So to actually fulfill all 613 commandments, you'd have to be some kind of weird bisext, priest, non-priest, king, not king, like there's all these rules. So it's the concept more than the details. And then if you actually read what's in the traditional prayer book and in the Talmud and in other sources, there are absolutely places where you make statements of Jewish belief. The passage in Mishnah Sanhedrin, we may look at a bit later, that describes everyone in Israel, all members of Israel have a share in the world to come, except for these three groups of people. Those who say the Torah is not from heaven, those who say resurrection of the dead is not to be found in the Torah, and an apicorus, or a heretic who doesn't believe the core principles. Well, first of all, they're assuming there's an afterlife. That's a belief statement, right? No share in the world to come. And then they're saying, well, if you don't believe this, if you don't believe that, then you don't have a share in the world to come. Rabbi Akiva even says someone who reads the outside books, the books we told you not to read. A Jewish leader telling you not to read something? Again, it feels somewhat foreign, but this is there. There's a ritual series of blessings recited daily in the prayer service called the Amidah, or the standing prayers, also known as the Shmoneh Esrei, or the 18 blessings. Technically, there are 19 blessings now because they added one in the Middle Ages against the heretics, the Midim. But if the Big Ten can have 16 teams, then your 18 blessings can have 19 blessings or more. And Maimonides, in fact, in the Middle Ages, wrote a list of things every Jew should believe, called Ani Ma'amin, I believe with perfect faith. By the way, we actually sing an adapted version of one of those in our high holiday services, but we sing, I believe with perfect faith in the coming of peace, where Maimonides' version said, I believe with perfect faith in the coming of the Messiah. And even though he tarries, still I believe. But it's an affirmation of faith. It's a doxology. So, and that's recited as part of the daily Orthodox prayer service. So where did this idea come from that Judaism is just about deed and not creed? Well, it came from people who didn't believe in the creeds. They no longer believe what they were supposed to believe, but they still wanted to feel fully Jewish, and so they reframed what Judaism is all about. This happened in the Reform movement in the 1880s, where they listed a basic series of beliefs that the Reform movement held, and they said the belief in an afterlife is foreign to Judaism. We just read that the rabbis were talking about a world to come 2,000 years before, but the Reform movement decided, since that wasn't respectable to believe, it's not Jewish anymore. And so you will hear people say, Jews don't believe in an afterlife. Judaism is all about no, maybe you don't believe. Maybe some Jews don't believe. Our Jews don't believe in that afterlife. But to say that all Jews don't believe, or that Judaism never believed, well, that's just not historically accurate. So we have to battle with that side too, because if it's all deed and not creed, who cares what language you're saying, right? It doesn't matter. You could be fully traditional and just say, if the deed is say the words, so you say the words, but the focus is on the deeds. But our point is that what you believe, what you think actually makes a difference too. Now, I alluded to earlier this concept of Jewish philosophy, the idea that maybe there is a point of harmony between the Greek discipline of philosophy. Remember, the word philosophy has two roots, philo, which is love or love, and sophia, which is wisdom. So a philosopher is someone who loves wisdom, who wants to know. And in the Middle Ages, there was a renaissance of Hellenistic philosophy because it had managed to survive in remote monasteries in the Byzantine Empire, not in the Roman Empire, and had been translated into Arabic. And it was often through Arabic translations that Jews experienced Maimonides, Plato, and a number of these other thinkers. Sometimes this led in a more mystical direction. In fact, if you study Kabbalah or medieval Jewish mysticism, it shows very interesting features of Neoplatonism. And there's also the work of a man named, of an author attributed as Plotinus, who I believe is a combination of Aristotle and Plato, because they didn't know they were two separate writers at one time. So they got kind of mixed up, and then trying to harmonize those two was particularly tricky, but they led to kind of very interesting, creative, mystical thoughts. When you try to prove something is consistent when it really isn't, because it never was, you're going to come up with some interesting solutions. But Aristotle in particular was of real attraction to Jewish thinkers in the Middle Ages, but they weren't the first ones to have to think this through. In fact, there was a writer who was not preserved by the Jews, but was preserved by the Christian church named Philo of Alexandria. And he wrote around the 1st century of the Common Era. He was one of the leaders of that community. And you can hear by his name how Hellenized he is, right? His name is Philo, not some Hebrew name. And he tried to harmonize Plato and Genesis. So he tried to explain how the world was created in 6 days, because 6 is the most perfect number. Not because God got tired and had to rest on day 7, but because 6 is the perfect number. Now, why is 6 the perfect number? It's the only number that is both the sum and the product of its parts. 1 plus 2 plus 3 is 6. 1 times 2 times 3 is 6. Perfect. Now, does that prove 6 is the perfect? Oh, no. It's like logic games, right? You're trying to demonstrate how wonderful this is, but it's sort of a sideshow. And he describes, Philo describes Moses as the perfect philosopher. And it wasn't because some kind of magic God showed up with big fire and pillars. No. He had the deepest knowledge of the universe and had ultimate knowledge of the universal truths. That's how Moses is described as a lawgiver, like Solon of Athens. So Philo sort of sets the template for this, but it really is in the Middle Ages under Maimonides and another thinker named Yehuda Halevi, Saadia Gaon's another one, where they begin to really grapple with Aristotelian philosophy and how can I harmonize this with Jewish practice. In particular, Maimonides was really challenged by all the anthropomorphisms in the Bible. After all, the God of Aristotle is not the God of Moses or the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The God of Aristotle is like a first cause. It sets everything in motion. It has universal laws. He doesn't reveal Torahs. He doesn't smite Pharaoh or the Egyptians with plagues. That's so mechanical. And so trying to harmonize Aristotle with all of this anthropomorphism required Maimonides to talk a lot in terms of allegories and speaking in the language of human beings, but maybe not meaning exactly what it says. Maimonides, in fact, wrote a book in Judeo-Arabic that really lays out his philosophy. He wrote plenty of books in Hebrew for the masses, like that list of 13 Principles of Faith. But if you read his philosophy book, he wrote it in Judeo-Arabic, which is Arabic written in Hebrew letters. So it's for a very limited audience, Jews who were literate in literary Arabic, not street Arabic, but not for Arabs because it was in Hebrew letters. So it was this limited audience for what he called the Guide for the Perplexed, which was to try to clarify how is it that Aristotle has so much wisdom, but was a pagan, and the Bible has so much truth, but doesn't seem to agree with Aristotle. So he had to try to square that circle as best he could. Now, the real grappling that we have with Jewish philosophy is sometimes it's based on a weird cosmology because they believe the earth was flat and all the they're trying to make sense of things in a world that we know is not true. But the other challenge is they were trying to use philosophy to prove that traditional rabbinic Judaism made sense. So it's not that they looked at rabbinic Judaism through the lens of philosophy and said, what needs to change? The given was rabbinic Jewish practice. The 613 commandments, Maimonides himself makes a list of them. That was the given. And then we have to figure out how can we make the given make sense in terms of philosophy. You'll sometimes see this, by the way, in philosophy of religion, which is a really interesting discipline where people who are philosophers grapple with some of the religious claims and then analyze them using philosophy. But sometimes it becomes apologetics, where they've assumed the religion claim, and now they have to prove it is reasonable using philosophy. They can't prove it absolutely true, but at least they can prove it's reasonable to hold that kind of a belief. One of the primary figures doing this right now is a professor at, I think he's at Notre Dame, named Alvin Plantinga, who's very smart and very creative in his writing, and I think totally wrong on his facts, you know? But that's again, the challenge you run into when you're given is the religious claims and practice. So Maimonides didn't really take philosophy and use it to change Judaism. He was reinterpreting it, but wasn't changing the practice. It really isn't until the modern period of the Enlightenment, we think of people like Spinoza or thinkers in the 19th century. There's another writer named Solomon Maimon. You can hear from his name that he's naming himself after Maimonides, who also begins to challenge this, taking philosophy and saying, wait a minute, this Jewish stuff doesn't make sense. So Spinoza, for example, would say that commandment where it says, believe this, it's absurd to tell anyone to believe anything. You can't force anyone to believe anything. You can make them say something. You can force them to say they believe something, but you can't change what their mind thinks. You have to convince them. You have to show them through reason and argument that it's true. And so having a commandment that says what you should believe or not believe doesn't make any sense. Why bother with that? And Spinoza also disagreed with the whole concept of rabbinic law because he felt law comes from political power and from having sovereignty. And if the Jews don't have sovereignty anymore, they shouldn't be able to make laws anymore. So we'll get more into Spinoza later in the class. Ultimately, the Jewish Enlightenment, which happens later in the 19th century, more like in the second half of the 19th century, primarily in Europe, this Enlightenment, or Haskalah as it calls itself, is really an intersection of both philosophy applying to Jewish life, but also socialization factors happening. Jews are beginning to become emancipated in Western Europe and certainly in North America. They're becoming assimilated to the surrounding culture. They're learning Russian, which they didn't know before, so they can experience Russian high culture, those who are able to learn it. So they begin to see possibilities to change Jewish life just to be integrated with the surrounding culture, not just from a belief system. And so some of the reform movements changes where they said, we don't believe in an afterlife, we don't believe in dietary laws. Well, they came up with reasons for it later, but my guess is people stopped following the dietary laws first for a variety of reasons, and then they came up with, highfalutin reasons later. We're very good at rationalization. And in fact, even people who study how we make decisions, Malcolm Gladwell's Blink, for example, talks about this. They found that the part of the brain that makes the decision fires first, and the reasoning part fires second. So we often make a gut decision, and then we come up with reasons later to justify it, rather than actually dispassionately evaluate the reasons and then make a final decision. So earlier models of secular Jewish community, of which we're an heir, took a different take on it than we did. I sometimes say that these early Jewish secularists, we're talking the Yiddishists and Jewish socialists, or the early Zionist movement, or the ethical culture movement, which also comes out of Jewish roots but goes in a very secular direction. They were what I call agnostic on their atheism. That is, many of the people who were members of these groups were atheists. They didn't believe in a God. They didn't pray to a God. But their official standard for the group was your personal belief is your private business. Whatever you think is up to you. What we do here is X. If it was a secular Jewish school, then we're just going to learn Yiddish language and Jewish history and Jewish holiday symbols and have a Purim carnival, and whatever you believe is up to you. It was ethical culture, was more focused on ethical behavior. That was, again, deed not creed is one of the principles of that movement. And in general, whatever they picked as their core practice was like the lowest common denominator. And they didn't go beyond that into what do you actually believe and how do you live and where do you find meaning in life. That's not our department. we're providing Jewish culture or Jewish community or ethical values. Now, there were limits to this. What are your holidays going to be? I mean, you might pick some of the Jewish holidays, but some of them are really religious. Like Yom Kippur, that's the traditional versions are pretty religious, right? In fact, there's a wonderful document we'll look at later in the class from these early secularists where they listed what holidays they were going to celebrate in the early workman's circle school communities. They did not mention Rosh Hashanah. They did not mention Yom Kippur. They didn't mention Sukkot, interestingly enough, because for them, that was a harvest holiday and we're urban proletariat. So what does that have to do with us? They do mention Hanukkah, that passed muster. They mention Purim, that passed muster. They mentioned Passover. I mean, if you're a socialist, worker rebellion, like Passover is right up your alley, okay? They mentioned a holiday called Lag BaOmer, which is the 33rd day of counting the Omer, celebrating a rebellion of Rabbi Akiva against the Romans, which is one of the connections to the holiday. But they don't mention the holiday of Shavuot, which is what you're counting toward. What do you mean 33 days? So what? But that was the end for them. So they didn't mention any of the traditional Jewish fast days. They did include Lincoln's birthday as a celebration of what they called Negro emancipation. They included the Russian Revolution, but they let you decide when you wanted to celebrate it, because some like the March Revolution, some like the October Revolution or the November Revolution, and where you dated it depending on the calendar you were using. So the point is that they had to make choices over what to include, but choosing which holidays and how to do them was tricky. And specifically for life cycle events, they had no bar mitzvah, because what's the core of a bar mitzvah is mitzvah, is commandment, and they weren't in that business. So if you were a member of a secular Jewish school, they would give you schooling after school multiple days a week and on Sundays. But you wanted a bar mitzvah, you had to hire a rabbi and rent a hall and go do it yourself. It was not something the community offered, because they were defining themselves in some ways negatively. We're Jewish culturally, but not that. And they were in the rejectionist phase. Many of them had been raised religious, and they didn't quite see how you could reject lighting Shabbat candles with a commandment, but still light Shabbat candles. And it really is almost a second generation, even of those communities, that begin to come up with secular blessings for candle lightings or secular songs they could sing at a Seder. It was sort of grappling with, what do we do if we're not religious? What do we do? What's the filler now? So where we're, again, a little bit different is that we're more willing to explicitly assert a positive philosophy of humanism, but there are risks to doing that. Once you describe what people believe, they think you're telling them what they should believe. It's the difference between descriptive and prescriptive. Ideally, I see my job as a humanistic rabbi as describing what my community believes. But I'm not just a polling machine, right? And sometimes if I say, well, this is what we believe, and somebody doesn't believe something, and they feel like I'm telling them I'm being prescriptive instead of descriptive. And it's a very delicate balance there. Also, our community tends to attract individualists, people who like to think for themselves. So I sometimes joke that whenever we do responsive reading in our community, it feels kind of ironic because we're telling everyone to say the same thing. And part of the point is you can make up your own mind. So I'm reminded of a scene in Monty Python's The Life of Brian, where Brian, who's a quasi-messianic figure, is fleeing from a large group. And he says to them, "You don't need me, you can all think for yourselves." And then 5,000 people say in unison, "Yes, we can all think for ourselves. You're all individuals. We're all individuals." And sometimes our movement feels like that when we're telling everyone, you decide your own life. Everyone say with me, I decide my own life. What? So that's one of our challenges, is getting people to be on the same page. Plus, individualists tend not to join groups. So we've picked an ideology that appeals to individualists who might never join anything. Or if they do, they're nervous about it. I remember we had an article come out about my work with the congregation shortly after I joined, and somebody called me afterwards and said, I saw your article in the Tribune, it was very nice, and I generally like what you stand for, I just don't like organized religion then. And I said, well, if only everybody who didn't like organized religion would actually join something, then we might have a voice and be able to, create community out of this and get beyond the, I don't like that, but here's what I do. We also have, even within the boundaries we do set for our movements, a range of possible options. as I said, we don't have an inquisition that's going to pursue people to find out what they believe as an individual. And we're not going to, drum people out if they think one thing or something else. And on the other hand, if we do have boundaries and say we don't want gender segregation in a service, for example, if someone comes in that wants that, well, we've told them no. And some people are afraid of saying no because, well, that person has a right to their opinion. So drawing that line between what we believe and what we don't allow can be a tricky balance to find. So whenever we assert our philosophy or say this is what humanistic Jews believe, ideally I'm being descriptive. Occasionally it may come across as prescriptive. I do have some training and background and knowledge in our movement, so that does help give me some credibility to do that. But ideally, what I'm trying to express is the general consensus, and that's shifted over time. One example of this is wearing ritual clothing. Our movement historically was not a movement where people wore a tallis, prayer shawl, or a kippah, the traditional head covering for men or for women now these days too. And where the Reform movement has gone back and added it back in, they used to not have it either. If you grew up in the 50s or 60s, they told you to take your head off going to a Reform temple, because that's what you do in civilized worship. Nowadays, you see them on all the time. But even in a Reform temple, people get to choose if they wear it or not. I've never had anybody give me grief going to a Reform temple and not putting one on. Conservative temple, they'll tell you have to wear one. But in a Reform temple, they won't, because if it's meaningful to you. And our movement has had, over the last, I would say 15, 20 years, more people get involved in the movement who are more comfortable wearing those ritual items. They don't see it as God commanding them to do it. They do it for cultural continuity or a connection to their heritage or being part of Jewish culture. And so if it's meaningful to them, I like to say everyone's in charge of their own head. They can wear what they want to wear. But the look in the audience is different than it used to be even 20 years ago. So here's why we do take the risk of talking explicitly about our philosophy. And I'm going to wrap up with this, and then we can open up for questions or discussion questions or any reactions. The first is that it's important for us to stand for something. If you don't stand for anything, then you stand for nothing. And sometimes you have to draw boundaries to say no, to say this is what we do believe. And we find it much more satisfying to talk in terms of positive beliefs. I believe in the power of human beings. I believe in the importance of human rights. I believe in the power of science to understand the world. I believe in my responsibility to other people as a member of a shared community. I also believe in my right to self-actualize and to flourish to my own fulfillment. So these are strong beliefs. These are positive beliefs. And it's important to be able to articulate why you choose to do what you do in positive terms. So it's not that I don't keep kosher. I want to experience the wide world of human culinary creativity. I want to express my freedom in terms of what I wear and what I eat. And this is another way to do that. It's not that I'm willfully anti-kosher just to be anti-kosher to piss off my Orthodox relatives. I do it because I like the positives that come out of that kind of a lifestyle. We also find that it helps organize communities. If someone joins us and say, what are you about? Here's what we're about. Here's our core values. Here's what we stand for. So you can know that and not wonder, what have you gotten yourself into? We also provide an expression of the power of harmonizing what you say and what you believe. Where you have that discontinuity sometimes where people read the English side of the Reformed prayer book and say, what am I saying? We never have that problem here, because what we say in either language is exactly what we would believe and share. And we find that is more satisfying. You lose something on the continuity of saying the old words if you change them, but you gain something on the integrity side of living out your values and be able to sing with your full self what you're saying and what you're celebrating. We do provide an articulation of a voice on behalf of secular and cultural Jews who might not be members, because there are plenty of secularized Jews who are not members of anything, but who would agree with us on 85 to 95 to 110% of what we do, and nobody speaks for them. And people assume they have nothing to say and that they're not connected. And in fact, they do have Jewish connections, but they're very different from the religious community. And the last reason why we're important, and I think it's why a lot of people find their way to us, is that there is a satisfaction of having personal integrity, of saying, this is who I am and this is how I live. These are my values in a Jewish setting and out. I'm one person and one set of values in both places. You can't pay for that. And you can't stained glass window your way out of that. A lot of people have found their way to us and said, I just felt like a hypocrite in those places. I just couldn't say those words or sing those words or have those words said over me or at me by the rabbi. It's just not who I am. And they come to us and it's a relief. In fact, one of our secret tricks is that once you've experienced our service where you don't have that cognitive dissonance and you have that sense of integrity and harmony with what you're saying and what you're doing and how you live and who you are, it's very hard to go back anywhere else because you go somewhere else and all of a sudden, oh no, I know what those mean now. And it's even worse because I've seen there's another way to do it. So ideally, people that experience our communities find that sense of integrity, that sense of uplift and inspiration. And if we are losing something on the continuity side, we're gaining it on the inspiration of that harmony of belief and action.